Welcome to my YouTube channel, where history, mythology, and restful sleep come together in perfect harmony. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you tonight, ready to guide you through another fascinating journey into the past. Whether you're seeking knowledge, relaxation, or both, you've come to the right place. Each story I share is carefully crafted to educate your mind while gently lulling you into peaceful slumber. There's something truly magical about learning as you drift off, absorbing the wonders of our world and its ancient tales while your mind settles into rest. Tonight, I have an incredible story to share with you, one that will transport you through time and space, filling your imagination with vivid scenes and remarkable details. So get comfortable, adjust your pillows, take a deep breath, and let yourself relax. And if you enjoy these journeys we take together, please like and subscribe for all your true sleep education stories. Your support means the world to me and helps me continue bringing you these soothing narratives night after night. Now let's begin our story, The Man Who Wanted Everything. Nelson Rockefeller's journey through power, wealth, and the American dream. Tonight, as you settle in and let the world around you fade into the background, I want to take you on a journey through time. We're going back to a warm summer morning on July 8th, 1908, when the ocean breeze swept through Bar Harbor, Maine, carrying with it the scent of salt water and pine. In a comfortable summer cottage overlooking the Atlantic, a baby's cry rang out, announcing the arrival of a child who would spend his entire life caught between two powerful forces: the enormous weight of being born a Rockefeller and an even more powerful desire to become someone entirely his own. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller entered the world on the exact same day as his legendary grandfather, John Davison Rockefeller Sr. The timing seemed almost like fate, as if the universe was marking this child for something extraordinary. But to understand Nelson's story, we first need to understand just how wealthy, how impossibly, almost incomprehensibly wealthy his grandfather had become. John D. Rockefeller Sr. had literally redefined what it meant to be rich in America. He founded the Standard Oil Company in 1870, and through a combination of brilliant business strategy and ruthless competitive tactics, built it into a monopoly that controlled 90% of all oil refining and pipelines in the United States. By 1913, his personal fortune had reached about $900 million. Now, that number might not sound as impressive as today's billion-dollar tech fortunes, but here's the crucial part: that 900 million represented nearly 3% of the entire United States economy at the time. Think about that for a moment. If someone today controlled 3% of America's entire economic output, their wealth would be measured not in billions, but in hundreds of billions of dollars. Some historians estimate John D. Rockefeller's wealth, when adjusted properly, would equal $631 billion in today's money. He wasn't just rich, he was, by many measures, the richest person who has ever lived. This was the legacy waiting for baby Nelson as he took his first breaths. But it wasn't just money waiting for him, it was also a name that had become controversial, even hated in some quarters of American society. By the time Nelson was born, his grandfather had already become a symbol of corporate power run amok, of monopolistic practices that crushed competition and controlled entire industries. The Supreme Court would order Standard Oil broken up in 1911, just 3 years after Nelson's birth, shattering the oil empire into 34 separate companies. Nelson's parents understood the complicated inheritance their children would receive. His father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had spent much of his own life trying to rehabilitate the family name through philanthropy and careful public relations. He was a serious, disciplined man who believed deeply in the responsibilities that came with wealth. He had donated the land for the United Nations headquarters in New York. He had funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg. He had given away hundreds of millions to universities, hospitals, and medical research. Nelson's mother, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, brought something entirely different to the family. Her father, Nelson Wilmarth Aldrich, had been a powerful United States senator from Rhode Island, so she understood political power from the inside. But Abby was also creative, cosmopolitan, and passionate about modern art at a time when most wealthy Americans still preferred safe, traditional paintings. She would co-found the Museum of Modern Art in 1929, helping to bring Picasso, Matisse, and other revolutionary artists to American audiences. These were Nelson's parents, a father who represented duty, discipline, and philanthropic responsibility, and a mother who valued creativity, beauty, and pushing boundaries. Nelson would spend his life trying to embody both sets of values, and the tension between them would shape everything he did. The Rockefeller children grew up in a world of extraordinary privilege, but their parents were determined that wealth wouldn't spoil them. The family maintained multiple residences, a grand townhouse at 10 West 54th Street in Manhattan, a sprawling country estate called Kikuit in Pocantico Hills, Westchester County, and a summer home in Seal Harbor, Maine. Each property was staffed by dozens of servants, filled with priceless art collections and maintained like small kingdoms. Yet John D. Jr. insisted that his children learn the value of money through direct experience. He gave each child a small weekly allowance, but with a catch. They had to keep detailed written ledgers of every penny they spent. If young Nelson wanted to buy a newspaper for 5 cents, he had to write it down. A trip to the movies required a ledger entry. This meticulous accounting, which his grandfather had practiced throughout his business career, was now being passed down to the third generation. The children could earn extra money through chores, killing flies in the summer months or pulling weeds from the garden. But they couldn't just take money from the family fortune. They had to work for it, account for it, justify every expenditure. The Rockefeller philosophy held that idleness was perhaps the greatest sin, and that wealth carried with it profound responsibilities. Nelson was different from his siblings almost immediately. His older brother, John D. Rockefeller III, was dutiful, conservative, and serious, just like their father. But Nelson was energetic, charismatic, and sometimes rebellious. He became the natural leader among the siblings. His younger brothers, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, all looked to Nelson for guidance and followed his lead in their childhood adventures. Even his sister Abby deferred to Nelson's strong personality. But school was a struggle for Nelson in ways that would have crushed a child with less confidence. He attended the Lincoln School, an experimental progressive school in Manhattan that the Rockefeller family had helped fund. Despite the innovative teaching methods designed to help all children learn, Nelson consistently ranked in the bottom third of his class. He nearly failed 9th grade entirely, which must have been deeply embarrassing for a child bearing one of America's most famous names. What nobody understood then was that Nelson was struggling with severe dyslexia, a learning disability that made reading and writing extraordinarily difficult. In those days, dyslexia wasn't well understood or diagnosed. Teachers and parents often assumed that children who struggled with reading were simply lazy or not very intelligent. But Nelson was neither lazy nor unintelligent. He was learning disabled in a time before anyone knew how to help him. So he developed coping strategies that would serve him for the rest of his life. He learned to be charming and persuasive, using his personality to get people to like him despite his academic struggles. He became an auditory learner, absorbing information through conversations and discussions rather than through reading. He developed an almost frantic work ethic, as if trying to prove, through sheer energy and determination, that he was just as capable as anyone else. He was also something of a rebel. Nelson was known to skip school occasionally, and once was found exploring New York City's sewer system when he was supposed to be in class. This wasn't typical troublemaking behavior. It was the curiosity of someone who learned by doing, by experiencing the world directly rather than reading about it in textbooks. His mother, Abby, recognized Nelson's creative spirit and nurtured it carefully. She had set up 2 private art galleries on the top floor of the family townhouse, in rooms that had once been the children's playrooms. These galleries, designed by Donald Desky, the same man who would later design Radio City Music Hall's magnificent interiors, displayed an eclectic mix of modern paintings, American folk art, and occasional pieces from John D. Jr.'s collection of Chinese porcelains. While Nelson's father preferred the safe, established beauty of ancient ceramics and medieval tapestries, Abby surrounded herself with challenging, provocative modern art. Young Nelson spent countless hours in these galleries, absorbing his mother's passion for creativity and innovation. When he went off to Dartmouth College, Abby even gave him a special allowance specifically for buying art. This wasn't just spending money. It was an education in developing a discerning eye, in understanding value and beauty, in learning how art could communicate ideas that words never could. At Dartmouth, Nelson found his footing. He was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, the prestigious academic honor society, and graduated cum laude with a degree in economics in 1930. Once he could learn in his own way, without the constant pressure of reading and writing assignments, his intelligence became apparent. He wasn't a scholar in the traditional sense, but he had gifts that would prove far more valuable in the world of politics and business. The ability to understand complex systems quickly, to persuade people to his point of view, and to organize large groups toward common goals. Just days after graduation, on June 23, 1930, Nelson married Mary Todd Hunter Clark, known to everyone as Todd. She came from a prominent Philadelphia family, and their wedding was a major social event that brought together America's industrial and political elite. The marriage would produce 5 children over the next decade: Rodman, Anne, Stephen, Michael, and Mary. It would last 32 years, though as we'll see, the relationship would become increasingly strained as Nelson's ambitions grew and his attention wandered to other women and other priorities. After a 9-month honeymoon traveling through Europe, Nelson returned to begin his career. He worked briefly at Chase National Bank's London and Paris offices. The bank was largely owned by the Rockefeller family, so this was essentially training within the family business empire. But international banking didn't capture Nelson's imagination. He wanted something more dynamic, more creative, more impactful. What did capture his attention was Rockefeller Center, the massive commercial real estate development his father had launched in the late 1920s. When ground broke in 1931, right in the depths of the Great Depression, it represented the largest private construction project in New York City's history. The project would eventually cover 14 acres in Midtown Manhattan and include 19 commercial buildings. But in 1931, it was an enormous gamble that the Depression would end and that New York would continue to grow and prosper. Nelson joined Rockefeller Center's board of directors in 1931 at age 23. His initial role focused on working with artists who would embellish the complex with murals, sculptures, and other artwork. This was perfect for Nelson, given his mother's influence and his own developing passion for art. It brought him into contact with some of the era's most challenging artists, including the famous Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. The Rivera Commission became one of the most controversial episodes in Rockefeller Center's early history. Rivera was a committed communist, and the massive mural he created for the main building's lobby, titled "Man at the Crossroads," included a prominent portrait of Vladimir Lenin. When the Rockefeller family discovered this, they were horrified. After failed attempts to convince Rivera to modify the work, they made the painful decision to destroy the mural entirely, even though it meant paying Rivera his full fee and wasting the work already completed. It was a clash between artistic freedom and commercial pragmatism, between creative vision and family reputation. The controversy taught Nelson important lessons about the limits of patronage, about the complications that arise when art, politics, and business intersect, and about the reality that sometimes difficult decisions have to be made quickly and decisively, even when they're not entirely satisfying. But Nelson proved remarkably adept at the business side of Rockefeller Center. He was skilled at finding tenants for the buildings, at negotiating complex deals, and at navigating the financial and political challenges that a project of this massive scale inevitably encountered. He demonstrated leadership abilities that made him indispensable to the family's business operations. By 1938, at the young age of 29, Nelson was named president of Rockefeller Center, one of the most prestigious commercial properties in America. Around this same time, Nelson's interests were being pulled in a completely different direction: Latin America. In 1935, he had become a director of Creole Petroleum Company, a Venezuelan subsidiary of Standard Oil of New Jersey. For most people, this would have been just another corporate board position, something to add to a resume and perhaps attend quarterly meetings. But Nelson approached it completely differently. He made extensive trips to Venezuela and other Latin American countries in 1937 and 1939. Immersing himself in the region, he learned Spanish fluently. He studied the economic and social conditions firsthand. He developed genuine relationships with local business leaders and politicians. He became fascinated by the challenges of development, by the possibilities for improving living standards through smart investments and enlightened business practices, and by the strategic importance of Latin America to the United States. What Nelson witnessed in Latin America troubled him deeply. He saw Nazi influence growing throughout the region. German businesses were investing heavily. Cultural organizations were spreading fascist ideology. As Europe moved inexorably toward war in the late 1930s, Nelson became convinced that the United States was dangerously neglecting its southern neighbors, both for strategic military reasons and for humanitarian ones. In 1939, following his Latin American trip, Nelson prepared a detailed memorandum for President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He outlined his concerns about Nazi penetration in the region and recommended a comprehensive program of cooperation with Latin American nations. He argued that the United States needed to take immediate action to counter Axis influence and demonstrate that American democracy offered more than German fascism. The memo caught Roosevelt's attention. In August 1940, with war raging in Europe and American neutrality becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, President Roosevelt created a new position and asked Nelson to fill it: Coordinator of the Office of Inter-American Affairs. At age 32, Nelson Rockefeller was suddenly responsible for all aspects of American relations with Latin America: economic cooperation, cultural exchange, propaganda efforts to counter Axis influence, and even intelligence gathering. This was Nelson's real entry into public service, and it would prove to be a defining moment in his life. The Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, often called OCIAA, became a model for what government agencies could accomplish when given resources, autonomy, and clear objectives. Nelson brought in talented people from business, academia, and the arts. He created programs in public health, agricultural development, and education. He understood intuitively that winning hearts and minds in Latin America required more than just political speeches and military alliances. It required tangible improvements in people's daily lives. One of OCIAA's most effective initiatives involved health programs. Medical teams traveled throughout Latin America, working with local governments to combat yellow fever, malaria, and other tropical diseases that were devastating rural populations. These weren't just humanitarian efforts, though they were certainly that. They were also strategic investments. Healthy populations were more productive, more politically stable, and less susceptible to extremist ideologies. The office also pioneered cultural diplomacy programs that brought musicians, artists, and intellectuals between the United States and Latin America. The goal was to create networks of understanding and appreciation, to build relationships that would outlast any particular political crisis or administration. Nelson understood what later generations would call soft power, the ability to influence others through attraction and persuasion, rather than through coercion or threats. Throughout World War II, Nelson continued to serve in this role, and his star in Washington continued to rise. In December 1944, President Roosevelt appointed him Assistant Secretary of State for American Republic Affairs, giving him even greater authority over Latin American policy. In this capacity, he attended the Inter-American Conference on Problems of War and Peace in Mexico City in February 1945, working to maintain hemispheric unity as the war neared its conclusion. Nelson also played a crucial role in the founding of the United Nations. At the San Francisco Conference in 1945, he advocated successfully for the inclusion of regional organizations within the UN framework, ensuring that Latin American nations would have a collective voice in the new international order being constructed. This was vintage Rockefeller: practical, focused on institutions and structures, willing to work patiently within the system to shape outcomes in his preferred direction. But Nelson's time in government wasn't without complications. He could be imperious and demanding, accustomed as he was to having vast resources at his disposal and to having his decisions implemented quickly without endless deliberation. He sometimes clashed with career diplomats who resented his wealth, his connections, and his tendency to go around established channels when he felt the situation required immediate action. While President Roosevelt had valued Nelson's energy and ideas, President Harry Truman, who took over after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, was less impressed with the young Rockefeller. In August 1945, after the war ended, Nelson resigned from his position as Assistant Secretary of State. He was only 37 years old, and he had accomplished remarkable things in government service. But he was also frustrated by the bureaucratic limitations of government work and eager to pursue his own ideas about development and capitalism's potential for positive social change. Now here's where we need to talk about money, about trusts, and about the sophisticated financial strategies that allowed the Rockefeller family to preserve and grow their enormous wealth across multiple generations, because Nelson's story isn't just about politics and art and ambition. It's also about how one of America's wealthiest families used legal structures to protect their fortune from taxes and ensure that their descendants would remain wealthy for generations to come. Back in 1934, when Nelson was 26 years old, his father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., made a momentous decision. He established irrevocable trusts for all 6 of his children. These weren't simple trust funds like you might imagine. They were sophisticated legal structures that would become the foundation for preserving Rockefeller wealth through multiple generations. Each of the 6 trusts was valued at approximately $40 million. Now remember, this was 1934, during the Great Depression. $40 million then would be equivalent to well over $700 million today. John D. Jr. was essentially giving each of his children the equivalent of nearly $1 billion in today's money, but he was doing it in a very specific way, designed to minimize taxes and protect the wealth from being squandered. An irrevocable trust is a legal arrangement where assets are transferred to a trustee who manages them for the benefit of beneficiaries according to specific terms. The key word is irrevocable. Once the trust is created and funded, the person who created it, called the grantor, cannot change the terms or take the assets back. This means the assets are legally no longer part of the grantor's estate, which has enormous tax advantages. When you transfer assets into an irrevocable trust, those assets are removed from your taxable estate. When you eventually die, estate taxes aren't calculated on those assets because they don't legally belong to you anymore. They belong to the trust. In the 1930s and 1940s, estate tax rates could reach 70% or even higher for the largest fortunes. By using trusts, the Rockefeller family avoided having 70% of their wealth seized by the government every time someone died and passed their assets to the next generation. But John D. Jr. didn't stop with just one round of trusts. In 1952, he established another set of trusts, this time for his grandchildren. These trusts were designed to skip a generation, passing wealth directly from grandparents to grandchildren while avoiding estate taxes at the children's generation. This is sometimes called a generation-skipping trust, and it was a brilliant financial maneuver. Think about how wealth normally flows in families. A wealthy person dies and passes assets to their children, and estate taxes are paid. Then those children grow old and die, passing whatever's left to their children, the grandchildren, and estate taxes are paid again. Each generation sees the fortune diminished by taxes. But with generation-skipping trusts, wealth can flow from grandparents directly to grandchildren, avoiding one entire layer of estate taxation. The Rockefeller trusts were structured with extraordinary sophistication. They held shares in the successor companies to Standard Oil, which had been broken up by the Supreme Court but continued to be immensely profitable. They held real estate, including valuable holdings in Rockefeller Center. They were diversified across multiple asset classes: stocks, bonds, real estate, and other investments. This diversification protected the family fortune from any single economic disaster. The trusts also appointed professional managers to oversee the investments. In the Rockefeller case, Chase Bank, which the family had a major stake in, served as trustee. This meant that professional money managers, not the beneficiaries themselves, made investment decisions. This structure ensured that even if one generation included spendthrifts or poor business people, the wealth would be protected because they didn't have direct control over the underlying assets. The trusts also had specific terms for how much money beneficiaries could receive and when. According to one account of the Rockefeller Trust structure, each family member began receiving $10,000 per year at age 21. At age 24, the annual payment doubled to $20,000. It increased by $10,000 each year until age 30, when a Rockefeller heir could receive $130,000 per year. At age 30 or upon marriage, beneficiaries could begin receiving all the income generated by their portion of the trust, which typically ranged from $400,000 to $600,000 per year, depending on investment returns. This structured approach served multiple purposes. It prevented young heirs from suddenly having access to massive wealth before they were mature enough to handle it responsibly. It gave them enough money to live very comfortably, but not so much that they had no incentive to work or develop their own careers, and it preserved the principle of the trust, ensuring that future generations would also benefit. The Rockefeller trusts also used what's known as the waterfall method of wealth distribution. This meant that assets and income flowed down through generations according to predetermined rules, with each generation receiving income but not necessarily controlling the underlying principle. This structure could potentially last for multiple generations, protecting family wealth far into the future. When Nelson's personal finances came under scrutiny during his 1974 vice presidential confirmation hearings, it was revealed that he had paid $69 million in taxes over his lifetime, equivalent to roughly $350 million in today's dollars. His personal wealth, at the peak of his career, was estimated at $218 million, equivalent to about $1.1 billion today. But this was just his personal wealth. The broader family trusts held far more, and because of their structure, much of that wealth passed through generations largely tax-free. The use of trusts also provided asset protection beyond just tax advantages. Because the assets were owned by the trust, not by individual family members, they were generally protected from creditors and from lawsuits. If Nelson had been sued personally, plaintiffs couldn't easily reach assets held in the family trusts. This provided an extra layer of security for the family fortune. The Rockefeller approach to wealth preservation became a model that other wealthy families studied and attempted to replicate. The family didn't just create trusts and forget about them. They maintained a family office, essentially a private company, dedicated to managing the family's wealth, investments, and business interests. John D. Rockefeller Sr. had established one of the first full-service family offices in the United States back in 1882, and this office continued to evolve and grow through subsequent generations. By the time Nelson was an adult, the Rockefeller family office oversaw not just investments, but also philanthropic activities, real estate holdings, business ventures, and tax planning strategies. The office employed professional money managers, tax attorneys, accountants, and other specialists whose full-time job was protecting and growing the family fortune. This level of professional management ensured that the wealth didn't just survive, but actually continued to grow over time. The trusts also had another crucial feature. They invested heavily in assets that generated ongoing income, rather than just hoping for capital appreciation. The Standard Oil successor companies paid regular dividends. Real estate properties generated rental income. Bonds paid interest. This meant that trust beneficiaries received steady income streams year after year, not just one-time payments that could be quickly spent. There was also a strong emphasis on educating each generation about financial responsibility and stewardship. The Rockefeller children and grandchildren weren't just passive recipients of wealth. They were taught from a young age about money management, about the responsibilities that came with wealth, and about the importance of giving back to society through philanthropy. This education helped ensure that subsequent generations didn't squander what previous generations had built. But let's return to Nelson's story, because all of this financial structure was just the foundation that allowed him to pursue his true passions: business innovation, art collecting, and eventually political power. In 1946, after leaving government service, Nelson returned to private life with big ideas about how capitalism could be reformed to address global poverty. He became chairman of the board of Rockefeller Sr and oversaw a major expansion program. But Latin America continued to occupy his thoughts. He believed deeply that American business could be a force for positive change in the developing world if it was approached the right way. In July 1946, Nelson and his brothers established the American International Association for Economic and Social Development, or AIA. This was a non-profit organization designed to finance projects addressing health, education, agricultural, and social problems in Latin America. AIA represented the philanthropic side of Nelson's vision, using charitable funds to create models and demonstrate what was possible when you combined good intentions with professional management and adequate resources. But Nelson wasn't satisfied with just charity. In 1947, he organized the International Basic Economy Corporation, commonly known as IBEC, which would become one of the most important and controversial ventures of his career. IBEC was a for-profit corporation, but with a revolutionary twist. Its stated mission was to raise living standards in underdeveloped countries through new economic enterprises. Nelson believed that capitalism could be harnessed to do good while still making money for shareholders. He called it enlightened capitalism, or sometimes reformed capitalism. The concept behind IBEC was genuinely innovative for its time. Each foreign subsidiary would aim for 50% local ownership, demonstrating that American investment didn't have to mean American control or exploitation. The company would focus on what Nelson called basic economy sectors: food production, housing, consumer goods, and other areas where improvements could have immediate and visible impacts on ordinary people's lives. IBEC's first major venture was the Venezuelan Basic Economy Corporation, established in May 1947. The company operated supermarkets in Caracas, introducing modern retail concepts to a population that had never experienced self-service shopping. Imagine trying to explain to people who had always bought goods from individual vendors in markets that they should now put items in a cart, push it around a store, and then pay for everything at once at a checkout counter. It required teaching customers how to navigate turnstiles, how to use shopping carts, even what a shopping list was for. IBEC also developed dairy operations to improve milk production and distribution. It pioneered offshore fishing operations to increase protein availability. It created a company that provided mechanized agricultural services to small farmers who couldn't afford to buy their own equipment. Each venture was designed to improve efficiency, lower costs for consumers, create employment, and ideally make a profit for investors. The company expanded rapidly across Latin America. In Brazil, IBEC took over a local hybrid seed corn company called Agroceres and expanded it dramatically, eventually controlling 45% of the Brazilian seed corn market. In multiple countries, IBEC started poultry breeding operations through a subsidiary called Arbor Acres, bringing modern chicken farming techniques to regions that had never seen them. There were housing construction projects, building thousands of low-cost homes in Mexico, There were even mutual fund operations helping Latin Americans invest their savings. IBEC became a sprawling empire of subsidiary companies, each focused on some aspect of economic development. By the late 1960s, the company had operations in Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Puerto Rico, and beyond. It employed thousands of people and generated over $200 million in annual revenue. On paper, it looked like an extraordinary success, but IBEC also faced constant grinding challenges that revealed the tensions in Nelson's vision. Nationalist sentiment in Latin America often viewed American companies with deep suspicion, regardless of their stated good intentions. Many Latin Americans had experienced American businesses that came in, extracted resources or profits, and left nothing behind for local communities. IBEC claimed to be different, but proving it was another matter entirely. The most dramatic example came in 1969, when Nelson, by then governor of New York, visited Argentina. Mobs attacked IBEC properties, burning 14 of the company's 17 supermarkets in Buenos Aires. The violence was partly political, directed at Nelson personally and at American foreign policy, but it was also an expression of genuine anger about economic exploitation and foreign control of local businesses. Cultural differences created unexpected problems that Nelson's team hadn't fully anticipated. In Venezuela, customers struggled with the concept of supermarkets. They didn't understand turnstiles. They couldn't figure out how to use shopping carts. The whole idea of self-service was foreign to a culture where shopping meant personal interactions with individual vendors. IBEC had to essentially teach people how to shop in a completely new way. There were also persistent questions about whether IBEC was genuinely profitable or whether it survived partly through cross-subsidies from other Rockefeller business interests. The company's financial reports often showed modest profits, but critics argued that a truly independent company would have struggled to survive the way IBEC did, especially in its early years when it was establishing operations in challenging markets. The fundamental tension at IBEC's core was the contradiction between its social mission and its identity as a for-profit corporation. When the company focused too much on generating profits for shareholders, it was criticized for being just another exploitative American corporation, no different from the ones that had been extracting wealth from Latin America for decades. When it prioritized social goals over financial returns, investors became restless and questioned why they should accept lower returns just because the Rockefeller name was attached. Nelson's son Rodman would later serve as president and CEO of IBEC from 1968 to 1980, trying to navigate these same fundamental tensions. By the time Rodman took over, the global economic environment was changing rapidly. Oil shocks, inflation, political instability, and growing anti-American sentiment made IBEC's mission even more difficult. The company limped along through the 1970s, but never achieved the transformative impact that Nelson had originally envisioned. But while IBEC was struggling to prove that capitalism could have a conscience, Nelson was being drawn back toward government service. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who took office in 1953, appointed Nelson to several important positions. He served as Undersecretary of Health, Education, and Welfare from 1953 to 1954, and as Special Assistant to the President for Foreign Affairs from 1954 to 1955. In these roles, Nelson worked on reorganizing government agencies and developing Cold War strategies. But what Nelson really wanted was electoral office, a position where he could shape policy directly rather than just advising presidents. In 1958, at age 50, he decided to run for governor of New York. The campaign revealed Nelson at his political best: energetic, charismatic, comfortable pressing flesh, and striking up conversations with voters. He developed a signature greeting, "Hiya, fella," that became his trademark. Reporters started calling him Rocky, a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life. Nelson's opponent was the incumbent Democratic governor, Averell Harriman, who was himself a wealthy man from a powerful family. In what the New York Times called a battle of millionaires, Nelson prevailed by more than 500,000 votes. The Times observed that his election gave the final stamp of public approval to a name that once was among the most hated and feared in America. Nelson served as governor of New York for nearly 15 years, from 1959 to 1973, winning re-election 3 times. His tenure was marked by massive government expansion and ambitious building projects that transformed the state. He oversaw the dramatic growth of the State University of New York system, turning it into the largest public university system in the world. He expanded the state parks and highway systems. He created the New York State Council on the Arts, the first state government agency to provide arts subsidies, which became the model for the National Endowment for the Arts. His most visible legacy was an explosion of construction projects. The Empire State Plaza in Albany, a massive government complex that completely redesigned the state capital's downtown, Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in Manhattan, and his crucial support for the World Trade Center. Nelson believed deeply in the power of architecture and public works to inspire citizens and symbolize governmental strength and competence. But this expansion came at a cost. During Nelson's governorship, the number of state employees doubled. The state budget quadrupled. Taxes increased dramatically to pay for all these programs and buildings. Nelson borrowed heavily, pushing New York State deeper into debt to fund his ambitious vision. His critics argued that he was building monuments to himself while saddling future generations with enormous financial burdens. Throughout his time as governor, Nelson harbored ambitions for higher office. He sought the Republican presidential nomination in 1960, but withdrew when it became clear that Richard Nixon would be the nominee. In 1964, he ran again, but his campaign was severely damaged by a personal scandal that shocked the nation. In 1962, Nelson had divorced his wife Todd after 32 years of marriage. Just a year later, in 1963, he married Margaretta Happy Murphy, a woman 18 years his junior who had herself just divorced her husband and given up custody of her 4 children to marry Nelson. The speed of these events, the age difference, and especially Happy's abandonment of her children deeply offended many Americans, including many Republicans who might otherwise have supported Nelson's presidential ambitions. At the 1964 Republican National Convention, conservative delegates who had never liked Nelson's liberal policies found a perfect excuse to reject him. They heckled him during his speech, booed when he tried to defend his positions, and gave the nomination instead to Barry Goldwater, a conservative senator from Arizona who represented everything Nelson opposed in the Republican Party. Nelson's hopes of becoming president seemed to have died in that humiliating convention defeat. He ran one more time in 1968, again losing the Republican nomination, this time to Nixon for a second time. Nelson was stuck in a difficult position within his own party. He was too liberal for the increasingly conservative Republican base, supporting civil rights legislation, social welfare programs, and government activism that many Republicans opposed. Yet he was too Republican for Democrats, who appreciated some of his policies but could never quite trust a Rockefeller. One of the most controversial episodes of Nelson's governorship occurred in September 1971 at Attica Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in upstate New York. Inmates, protesting terrible conditions that included limited shower access, inadequate food, and allegations of racist treatment by all-white guards, took control of large parts of the prison and held 39 guards and staff as hostages. Over 4 days, negotiations took place between prison officials and inmate representatives. The inmates presented a list of 28 demands for improved conditions. State officials accepted most of the demands, but negotiations broke down over the question of amnesty for crimes committed during the takeover, especially after one guard died from injuries sustained in the initial riot. Hostages, prisoners, and outside observers all begged Governor Rockefeller to come to the prison to speak directly with the inmates and try to find a peaceful resolution. Nelson refused. Instead, he stayed in his Manhattan office and ultimately ordered state police to retake the prison by force. On the morning of September 13th, 1971, after a final ultimatum was rejected, a helicopter dropped tear gas into the prison yard where inmates had gathered with the hostages. State police and corrections officers then stormed in, firing nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition in approximately 6 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 39 people were dead, 29 inmates and 10 hostages, almost all killed by law enforcement gunfire, not by inmates. The violence at Attica shocked the nation. A special commission, led by Dean Robert McKay of New York University Law School, spent months investigating. Their report was devastating. The commission found that while conditions at Attica had justified protest, the state's response was catastrophic. They specifically criticized Governor Rockefeller for refusing to visit the prison personally and for ordering the assault without fully considering alternatives. The report called the retaking of Attica the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War, not counting Indian massacres. Nelson defended his decision for the rest of his life, arguing that giving in to prisoner demands would have encouraged violence at other prisons and that negotiation had reached a dead end. But Attica became a permanent stain on his legacy, a moment when his unwillingness to compromise and his faith in the use of force led to tragedy. Despite Attica, or perhaps partly because his handling of it appealed to law and order conservatives, Nelson was re-elected governor in 1970, defeating former Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg by nearly 700,000 votes. But by 1973, after 15 years in office, Nelson decided he had accomplished what he could as governor. He resigned in December 1973, returning to private life and focusing on his art collecting and business interests. Then came an unexpected opportunity. In August 1974, President Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace because of the Watergate scandal. Vice President Gerald Ford became president, and under the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, Ford needed to nominate a new vice president, subject to confirmation by Congress. He chose Nelson Rockefeller. The confirmation hearings became an exhaustive examination of Nelson's entire life, especially his finances. Congress wanted to know exactly how wealthy Nelson was, how he had accumulated his fortune, and whether his wealth created any conflicts of interest. Nelson was forced to reveal details of his finances that the Rockefeller family had kept private for generations. It emerged that Nelson had an estimated personal wealth of $218 million, equivalent to about $1.1 billion in today's money. He had paid approximately $69 million in taxes over his lifetime. He had made massive financial gifts to political associates, including nearly $50,000 to Henry Kissinger. He had even funded a scurrilous biography attacking political opponent Arthur Goldberg. Some tax experts questioned certain deductions Nelson had taken on his federal income taxes. After negotiations, Nelson agreed to pay nearly $1 million to settle the tax issues, though no actual illegalities were found. Conservative Republicans, who had never liked Nelson's liberal policies, voted against his confirmation. But enough moderate Republicans and Democrats supported him, and in December 1974, Nelson Rockefeller became the 41st Vice President of the United States. It should have been the culmination of his career, the achievement of national office, even if it wasn't the presidency itself. But Nelson's vice presidency under President Ford was deeply disappointing. Ford didn't give Nelson meaningful responsibilities. The president's staff, many of whom came from the Nixon administration, viewed Nelson with suspicion. Nelson, who had spent 15 years as the chief executive of New York State, making decisions and implementing policies, found himself sidelined and increasingly irrelevant. When Ford decided to run for election in his own right in 1976, he didn't choose Nelson as his running mate. Instead, under pressure from conservative Republicans who despised Nelson, Ford selected Senator Bob Dole of Kansas. Nelson's political career was over. He left office in January 1977 at age 68 after serving just 2 years as vice president. Nelson returned once again to private life. He focused on his art collection, which had grown to include thousands of works spanning modern art, pre-Columbian artifacts, and contemporary pieces. He founded Nelson Rockefeller Collection Inc., a company that produced and sold high-quality reproductions of works from his collection. He wanted to share the joy of living with beautiful objects with people who couldn't afford original art. On January 26, 1979, New Yorkers awoke to shocking news. Nelson Rockefeller had died of a heart attack at age 70. The official story was that he had died while working late at his office. But as details emerged in the following days, a different picture appeared. Nelson had actually died at his townhouse while in the company of Megan Marshak, a 25-year-old staff assistant. She had delayed calling paramedics for nearly an hour, leading to endless speculation about exactly what had happened. Even in death, Nelson Rockefeller was pushing boundaries and defying expectations. His funeral was attended by current and former presidents, governors, senators, and business leaders. Eulogists praised his vision, his energy, his commitment to public service, and his support for the arts. But there was also an undertone of sadness, a recognition that Nelson had never quite achieved what he had spent his entire life pursuing: the presidency itself. Nelson Rockefeller's net worth at death was approximately $1 billion in today's money. But remember, this was just his personal wealth. The broader Rockefeller family trusts held far more, spread across approximately 200 family members by the late 1970s. Today, the Rockefeller family fortune is estimated at about $8.4 billion, spread across more than 170 descendants. The trusts that John D. Rockefeller Jr. created in 1934 and 1952 are still operating, still generating income for beneficiaries, still managed by professional trustees and the family office. The 1934 trusts were structured to mature upon the death of the last beneficiary from the fourth generation, which means they could potentially last more than a century. This is exactly what they were designed to do: preserve wealth across multiple generations, minimizing taxes and protecting assets from being squandered by irresponsible heirs. The Rockefeller approach to wealth preservation became the model for how America's ultra-wealthy families protect their fortunes. Use irrevocable trusts to remove assets from taxable estates. Use generation-skipping trusts to avoid multiple layers of estate taxation. Diversify investments across multiple asset classes to protect against any single economic disaster. Employ professional managers who make decisions based on financial expertise rather than family sentiment. Structure distributions to prevent heirs from accessing too much wealth too quickly. Invest heavily in income-producing assets that generate steady cash flow. Maintain a family office that coordinates all financial, legal, and tax strategies. And importantly, invest in philanthropy. The Rockefeller family has given away an estimated $2 billion or more through various foundations over the generations. This wasn't just altruism, though there was certainly some of that. It was also smart public relations, turning the Rockefeller name from one associated with monopolistic robber barons into one associated with generous philanthropists supporting education, medicine, and the arts. Nelson Rockefeller's life was, in many ways, a monument to what immense wealth can accomplish and what it cannot. His wealth gave him opportunities that most people can only dream of. He received the finest education available. He traveled the world. He started businesses and philanthropic organizations. He bought incredible art. He built massive construction projects. He served in the highest levels of government. But his wealth couldn't buy him the one thing he wanted most: the presidency of the United States. Despite spending tens of millions of dollars on campaigns, despite having every possible advantage of name recognition and financial resources, Nelson could never quite connect with enough voters to win the Republican nomination, much less the general election. He was too liberal for conservatives and too Republican for liberals, too much the establishment figure in an era when voters were becoming increasingly skeptical of establishment politics. His personal life was complicated in ways that suggest wealth doesn't solve fundamental human struggles. His first marriage lasted 32 years, but ultimately failed, probably because Nelson was consumed by ambition and willing to sacrifice personal relationships for political advancement. His second marriage to a much younger woman scandalized the nation and probably cost him the presidency. He died in circumstances that were embarrassing and led to endless speculation. And yet Nelson Rockefeller left an enormous mark on the world. The State University of New York system that he built educates hundreds of thousands of students every year. The New York State Council on the Arts that he created became the model for arts funding across America. The buildings he constructed, from the Empire State Plaza to Lincoln Center, are landmarks that define New York's landscape. The Museum of Modern Art that his mother founded and that he led as president helped bring modern art to American audiences. His experiments with IBEC, however imperfect, showed that businesses could at least try to balance profit with social responsibility. Perhaps most importantly, the financial structures the Rockefeller family created, especially the sophisticated use of trusts to preserve wealth across generations while minimizing taxes, became the standard approach for wealthy families everywhere. Every ultra-rich family with dynastic ambitions has studied the Rockefeller model and attempted to replicate it. As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the lessons of Nelson Rockefeller's extraordinary life. Think about how privilege can provide opportunities but can't guarantee success or happiness. Reflect on how even the wealthiest most connected people face genuine obstacles and limitations. Contemplate the trade-offs between public service and private wealth, between ambition and personal relationships, between building monuments and touching individual lives. Nelson Rockefeller wanted to be president more than almost anything, and he never achieved it despite every conceivable advantage. Yet he accomplished things that most presidents never do. He built institutions that last. He supported artists who changed how we see the world. He showed that government could tackle big problems through ambitious programs and construction, even if the long-term costs of those programs remained controversial. His story reminds us that money can buy many things, but not everything. That ambition can drive achievement, but also exact a personal cost. That legacy is complex and multifaceted, with successes and failures intertwined in ways that resist simple judgment. That even the richest, most powerful people are still just people, struggling with the same fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and fulfillment that we all face. So rest now, knowing that no matter your circumstances, you have the opportunity to leave your own mark on the world. You might not have the Rockefeller fortune, you might never run for president, but you can still make choices about what matters to you, about what legacy you want to leave, about how you'll balance ambition with relationships, work with rest, achievement with contentment. Sweet dreams. If you found this story helpful and want to continue learning with us, please like this video and subscribe to Sleep Edification. We're here to bring you fascinating stories that educate and relax, helping you drift off to sleep while expanding your mind. Leave a comment below sharing which aspect of Nelson Rockefeller's life interested you most, and let us know what historical figure you'd like us to cover next. Until our next journey together, sleep well, dream big, and remember that every life, whether lived in poverty or privilege, contains lessons worth learning. The strategy that John D. Rockefeller Jr. employed wasn't something he invented overnight. It was the result of decades of learning from the best lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors money could buy. The family understood that preserving wealth across generations required more than just making smart investments. It required creating legal structures that could survive changes in tax law, economic conditions, and family circumstances. The irrevocable trust worked because of a fundamental principle in tax law. You can't be taxed on assets you no longer own. When John D. Jr. transferred shares of Standard Oil's successor companies into trusts for his children in 1934, those shares were no longer part of his estate. They belonged to the trust. When he eventually died in 1960, estate taxes weren't calculated on those assets because they weren't his anymore. They had already been transferred, years or even decades earlier. But the beauty of the trust structure went beyond just removing assets from the estate. The trust could be designed with specific terms about how and when beneficiaries received money. This prevented young heirs from suddenly having access to enormous wealth before they were mature enough to handle it. It gave them enough money to live comfortably, but not so much that they had no motivation to develop their own careers and identities. The trusts also protected the assets from beneficiaries' own poor decisions. If Nelson had made terrible business investments with his personal wealth and gone bankrupt, his creditors couldn't touch the assets held in the family trusts. If he had divorced, which he did in 1962, his ex-wife couldn't claim a portion of trust assets in the settlement. The trust assets were protected, ring-fenced from the chaos that could affect any individual family member's life. Another crucial element was the generation-skipping feature that John D. Jr. built into the 1952 trusts. In a normal inheritance pattern, wealth passes from grandparents to parents to children, with estate taxes extracted at each generational transfer. A fortune of $100 million might be reduced to $30 million after estate taxes when it passes to the children, and then to $9 million when it passes to the grandchildren. 2 generations of taxation can devastate even the largest fortunes. But generation-skipping trusts allow wealth to flow directly from grandparents to grandchildren, bypassing one entire level of taxation. The wealth is still used to support the middle generation through trust income, but the principle itself skips over them and goes directly to their children. This can preserve literally hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars that would otherwise be lost to taxes. The tax laws have evolved over the decades since the Rockefeller trusts were created. Congress has repeatedly tried to close loopholes that allowed the ultra-wealthy to avoid taxes. There's now a generation-skipping transfer tax designed specifically to prevent exactly what the Rockefeller trusts accomplished. But trusts created before these laws were enacted were often grandfathered in, allowed to continue operating under the old, more favorable rules. This means that some of the Rockefeller trusts, now nearly 90 years old, continue to operate with tax advantages that would be impossible to create today. They're living fossils from an era when wealth preservation strategies that are now illegal or heavily taxed were perfectly acceptable and common among the rich. The diversification strategy the trusts employed was equally important. Rather than putting all the family wealth into one investment or even one type of investment, the trusts spread assets across multiple categories. There were shares in the Standard Oil successor companies, which eventually became giants like ExxonMobil and Chevron. There were real estate holdings, including valuable properties in Rockefeller Center. There were bonds providing steady interest income. There were shares in banks, including Chase Manhattan Bank, where the family had significant influence. This diversification meant that no single economic disaster could wipe out the family fortune. When oil prices fell, real estate might be strong. When the stock market crashed, bonds would continue paying interest. The portfolio was constructed to weather any storm, to survive depressions, recessions, inflation, deflation, whatever the economy might throw at it. The trusts also generated income rather than just hoping for capital appreciation. The Standard Oil stocks paid regular dividends. The real estate properties generated rental income. The bonds paid interest. This meant that trust beneficiaries received steady cash flow year after year, not just one-time payouts that could be quickly spent. The income kept coming, generation after generation, like a financial river that never stopped flowing. Professional management was another key element. Chase Bank served as trustee for the main Rockefeller trusts, but they weren't making decisions in isolation. The family office, with its team of investment professionals, provided guidance and oversight. These weren't family members making investment decisions based on hunches or personal preferences. They were professional money managers with expertise in financial markets, real estate, tax law, and estate planning. This professional management ensured continuity across generations. Even when family members died or became incapacitated, the trusts continued to be managed by experts who understood the family's long-term goals. There was institutional memory, documented procedures, and professional standards that transcended any individual's lifespan. The family office itself became a model that other wealthy families studied and copied. It wasn't just managing investments. It was coordinating philanthropic activities, providing family members with financial education, handling tax planning, managing real estate properties, overseeing business ventures, and generally serving as the central nervous system for all Rockefeller financial activities. By the time Nelson was an adult, the family office employed dozens of people: investment analysts, real estate managers, tax attorneys, accountants, estate planners, and administrative staff. Their sole job was protecting and growing the Rockefeller fortune. This level of professional attention is something only the ultra-wealthy can afford, and it makes an enormous difference in how wealth is preserved and grown over time. There was also a strong emphasis on financial education for family members. The Rockefeller children and grandchildren weren't just passive recipients of trust income. They were taught from a young age about money, about investing, about the responsibilities that came with wealth. They attended family meetings where financial matters were discussed. They learned to read financial statements. They understood that they were stewards of wealth, not just consumers of it. This education helped ensure that subsequent generations didn't squander the fortune through ignorance or reckless spending. When Nelson and his brothers received their trust distributions, they understood what they were receiving and why. They had been prepared for it through years of instruction and gradual exposure to financial management. The philanthropic component was equally important, though often overlooked in discussions of wealth preservation. The Rockefeller family has given away more than $2 billion through various foundations over the decades. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, continues to this day, funding programs in public health, education, and scientific research around the world. This philanthropy served multiple purposes. It addressed social problems in ways that government often couldn't or wouldn't. It provided the family with an ongoing purpose beyond just accumulating more wealth. It generated positive publicity, transforming the Rockefeller name from one associated with monopolistic robber barons into one associated with generous benefactors supporting worthy causes. But philanthropy also had practical financial benefits. Donations to charitable foundations were tax-deductible, reducing the family's tax burden. Assets transferred to foundations were removed from taxable estates, and the foundations themselves could invest and grow their endowments tax-free, generating more money for charitable purposes while also providing family members with positions as foundation trustees and directors. The Rockefeller approach to wealth wasn't just about accumulating money. It was about creating a system, a machine, if you will, that could preserve and grow wealth across multiple generations while also providing family members with income, opportunity, and purpose. It was about building institutions that would outlast any individual life. And it worked. Today, nearly 120 years after John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s fortune peaked, there are still Rockefellers living off income generated by trusts established decades ago. The family is no longer the richest in America. They've been surpassed by tech billionaires and financial titans, but they remain extraordinarily wealthy and influential. The system John D. Jr. created in the 1930s and 1950s continues to function, continues to protect, continues to provide. This is the financial foundation that allowed Nelson Rockefeller to pursue his ambitions without worrying about money. He could spend 15 years as governor of New York, often at odds with business interests, because trust income meant he didn't need their approval or support. He could invest in experimental business ventures like IBEC that might never be profitable because failure wouldn't bankrupt him. He could buy art, build museums, and fund political campaigns because the money kept flowing from trusts he hadn't created and didn't control. But let's return to Nelson's political career, because that's where his story becomes most compelling and most tragic. After serving as governor of New York from 1959 to 1973, Nelson had accomplished extraordinary things. He had expanded the State University of New York from a small collection of teachers' colleges into the largest public university system in the world, with 64 campuses educating hundreds of thousands of students. He had overseen massive construction projects that literally reshaped New York's physical landscape. The Empire State Plaza in Albany, a government complex of modernist buildings that cost nearly $2 billion, was perhaps his most visible legacy. Critics called it cold and imposing, but Nelson saw it as a statement about government's importance and ambition. He wanted buildings that would inspire citizens and demonstrate that state government could tackle big challenges. Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, which Nelson strongly supported during its construction in the early 1960s, became one of the world's premier venues for opera, symphony, ballet, and theater. The complex included the Metropolitan Opera House, Avery Fisher Hall, the New York State Theater, and other facilities that brought world-class performing arts to New York audiences. He supported the construction of the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers that would become iconic symbols of New York until their destruction on September 11, 2001. Nelson understood that great cities needed great architecture, that buildings weren't just functional spaces, but symbols that communicated values and aspirations. He expanded the state highway system, connecting remote regions to urban centers and making travel throughout New York faster and easier. He created hundreds of new state parks and expanded existing ones, providing recreation opportunities for millions of New Yorkers. He established the New York State Council on the Arts, providing government funding for arts organizations throughout the state, a radical idea that became the model for the National Endowment for the Arts. But all of this expansion came at an enormous cost. State employment doubled during Nelson's governorship. The state budget quadrupled. Taxes increased dramatically. Nelson borrowed heavily, issuing state bonds to finance construction projects, pushing New York deeper into debt. His philosophy was that government should be active, engaged, ambitious, willing to tackle big problems through big programs. But critics argued that he was creating an unsustainable fiscal situation, building monuments to his own ego while burdening future generations with debt they would struggle to repay. The Attica prison riot in September 1971 became the darkest moment of Nelson's governorship and a permanent stain on his legacy. The prison, built in the 1930s, housed about 2,200 inmates in facilities designed for far fewer. Conditions were terrible. Inmates were limited to one shower per week and one roll of toilet paper per month. The prison was overcrowded, underfunded, and tensions between mostly black and Hispanic inmates and all-white guards had been rising for years. On September 9, 1971, a fight between inmates was broken up by guards, and rumors spread that the inmates involved were being beaten in retaliation. Angry prisoners rushed a faulty gate that gave way, suddenly allowing them access to other parts of the prison. They took control of a large section of the facility and seized 39 guards and civilian employees as hostages. Over 4 days, negotiations took place. The inmates presented 28 demands for improved conditions. State Corrections Commissioner Russell Oswald agreed to most of the demands, but negotiations broke down over questions of amnesty for crimes committed during the uprising, especially after one guard died from injuries sustained in the initial takeover. Hostages begged Governor Rockefeller to come to the prison. Prison officials requested his presence. Outside observers, including prominent civil rights leaders and journalists, pleaded with him to visit Attica and speak directly with the inmates. Nelson refused every request. He stayed in his Manhattan office, receiving updates but never visiting the site. On the morning of September 13th, after a final ultimatum was rejected, Nelson authorized the use of force to retake the prison. A helicopter dropped tear gas into the yard, where inmates had gathered with hostages. Then, state police and corrections officers stormed in with weapons. For approximately 6 minutes, they fired nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition into the smoke-filled yard. When it was over, 39 people lay dead or dying, 29 inmates and 10 hostages, almost all killed by law enforcement gunfire, not by inmates. Initial reports from prison officials claimed that inmates had slashed hostages' throats, but autopsies quickly revealed this was false. Nearly everyone had been killed by law enforcement bullets. The state had essentially massacred its own employees, along with the prisoners. The McKay Commission, appointed to investigate what happened, issued a scathing report. They found that prison conditions had been inhumane and that the inmates' grievances were legitimate. They criticized the use of force as excessive and unnecessary. They specifically condemned Governor Rockefeller for refusing to visit the prison personally, arguing that his presence might have made a peaceful resolution possible. Nelson defended his decision for the rest of his life. He argued that giving in to prisoner demands would encourage violence at other prisons across the state and country. He insisted that negotiations had reached a dead end and that force was the only remaining option. He claimed that his personal presence wouldn't have made a difference and might have made things worse by elevating the crisis to an even higher level. But many people never forgave him. The Attica uprising became a symbol of systemic problems in the American prison system. Overcrowding, racism, brutal conditions, and a willingness to use violence rather than address underlying problems. Nelson's role in the tragedy, his refusal to visit the prison combined with his authorization of deadly force, seemed to epitomize everything that was wrong with how people in power approached criminal justice. In the years that followed, 62 inmates were indicted for crimes committed during the uprising. Only one state trooper was ever charged. This disparity in prosecution suggested that the justice system was more interested in punishing prisoners than in holding law enforcement accountable for the deaths they caused. The Attica families, both inmates and hostages, filed lawsuits against the state that dragged on for decades. In 2000, New York State agreed to pay $12 million to settle claims by former inmates. In 2005, the state paid another $12 million to families of the hostages who were killed. These settlements came more than 30 years after the event, delayed justice for people whose lives had been shattered by 6 minutes of violence. For Nelson, Attica was a tragedy that he could never fully escape. In every profile written about him after September 1971, Attica was mentioned. In every speech he gave, protesters might show up with signs demanding justice for Attica victims. His decision not to visit the prison, his authorization of deadly force, his refusal to take responsibility for what happened, all of this became part of how history would remember him. Despite Attica, or perhaps partly because his hardline approach appealed to law and order conservatives, Nelson won re-election as governor in 1970, defeating Arthur Goldberg by nearly 700,000 votes. But by 1973, after 15 years as governor, Nelson had accomplished what he could In that office, the fiscal situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The state was deeply in debt. Taxes were high and becoming politically toxic. The energy crisis of 1973 was creating economic problems throughout the nation. In December 1973, Nelson resigned as governor, 15 months before his term was scheduled to end. He was 65 years old and, by most measures, should have been winding down his career. But fate had one more opportunity for him. On August 9, 1974, President Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace because of the Watergate scandal. Vice President Gerald Ford became president, and under the 25th Amendment, which had been ratified in 1967, Ford needed to nominate a vice president subject to congressional confirmation. He chose Nelson Rockefeller. The choice made sense in several ways. Nelson was experienced, having served in multiple federal positions and as governor of the nation's second-largest state. He was respected internationally for his work in Latin America. He had strong credentials in domestic policy. He represented the moderate, liberal wing of the Republican Party, which Ford needed to balance against the conservative base. But the confirmation process became an exhaustive examination of Nelson's entire life. Congress wanted to know everything about his finances, his business dealings, his charitable contributions, his art collection, his personal life, and his political activities. The hearings went on for months, becoming one of the most thorough vetting processes any nominee had ever undergone. Nelson was forced to reveal financial details that the Rockefeller family had kept private for generations. He disclosed that his net worth was approximately $218 million, equivalent to about $1.1 billion in today's dollars. This made him far wealthier than any previous vice president and wealthier than most presidents had been. He revealed that he had paid approximately $69 million in taxes over his lifetime, equivalent to about $350 million today. This was an enormous sum, demonstrating that despite all the trust structures and tax planning, the Rockefellers were still paying substantial amounts to the government. But there were also embarrassing revelations. It emerged that Nelson had made large financial gifts to political associates over the years. He had given nearly $50,000 to Henry Kissinger, who had served as a foreign policy advisor to Nelson before becoming National Security Advisor and Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford. The gift raised questions about whether Nelson was essentially buying influence with people who might later be in positions to help him. Perhaps most controversial was the revelation that Nelson had commissioned and paid for a scurrilous biography of Arthur Goldberg, his opponent in the 1970 New York gubernatorial election. The book was filled with negative material about Goldberg and was distributed to reporters and voters during the campaign. This seemed like a cynical use of wealth to destroy a political opponent's reputation. Tax experts also questioned certain deductions Nelson had taken on his federal income tax returns over the years. Some of these deductions were aggressive interpretations of tax law, pushing the boundaries of what was legal. After negotiations with the IRS and Congress, Nelson agreed to pay nearly $1 million to settle outstanding tax issues, though no actual illegalities were found. He simply agreed to pay more than what he had originally paid to avoid further controversy. Conservative Republicans, who had never liked Nelson's liberal policies, used the confirmation hearings as an opportunity to attack him. Senators Barry Goldwater, Jesse Helms, and others voted against confirmation, arguing that Nelson was too liberal, too wealthy, and too connected to the Eastern establishment that conservatives despised. But enough moderate Republicans and Democrats supported Nelson's nomination. On December 19, 1974, after 4 months of hearings and investigations, the Senate voted 79 to 19 to confirm Nelson as vice president. The House of Representatives followed with a vote of 287 to 128. On December 19th, Nelson Rockefeller was sworn in as the 41st Vice President of the United States. It should have been the culmination of his career, the achievement of national office after decades of public service. But Nelson's vice presidency turned out to be deeply disappointing and frustrating. President Ford, who had himself become president through the 25th Amendment after Nixon's resignation, was struggling to establish his own authority and identity. He was dealing with the aftermath of Watergate, a terrible economy, and a Democratic Congress that was asserting its power after years of imperial presidencies. Ford didn't give Nelson meaningful responsibilities. The president's staff, many of whom had served under Nixon, viewed Nelson with suspicion. They saw him as too ambitious, too liberal, too likely to overshadow the president. Nelson, who had spent 15 years as the chief executive of New York, making decisions and implementing policies every day, found himself sidelined and increasingly irrelevant. He was given some ceremonial duties and asked to chair a few committees, but he had no real power. He attended cabinet meetings, but wasn't really part of the decision-making process. He traveled occasionally on behalf of the president, but had little influence over policy. For someone who had been used to wielding enormous power as governor, the vice presidency was a gilded cage. The domestic policy position that Ford had promised Nelson largely disappeared. Foreign policy was dominated by Henry Kissinger, who served as both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. Economic policy was handled by Treasury Secretary William Simon and other advisors who didn't report to Nelson. The vice president was essentially a spare tire, kept in reserve in case something happened to the president, but not really needed for day-to-day operations. As the 1976 election approached, Nelson hoped that Ford would keep him on the ticket, but Ford was under enormous pressure from conservative Republicans who despised Nelson and everything he represented. Ronald Reagan was challenging Ford for the Republican nomination, and Reagan's supporters made clear that they would never support a ticket that included Rockefeller. In November 1975, Ford announced that he would not include Nelson on his ticket if he won the nomination. Instead, Ford would choose Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, a conservative who could help unite the party. Nelson received the news as a public humiliation, a rejection by his own party and his own president. Nelson's political career was over. After serving just 2 years as vice president, having accomplished essentially nothing of significance in the role, he left office in January 1977 when Jimmy Carter was inaugurated. Nelson was 68 years old, and for the first time in his adult life, he held no position in government or politics. He returned to private life, focusing on projects that had always brought him joy: art collecting, philanthropy, and business ventures. He established Nelson Rockefeller Collection, Inc., a company that produced and sold high-quality reproductions of artworks from his extensive personal collection. Nelson had spent decades assembling one of the greatest private art collections in America, with works by Picasso, Matisse, Calder, and countless other modern masters. He wanted to share the beauty of these works with people who couldn't afford original art. The reproduction business was about democratizing access to beauty, about making great art available to ordinary people. It was a project that connected back to his mother's vision of art as something that should be shared, not hoarded by the wealthy. The reproductions were expensive by ordinary standards, but far cheaper than original works. and they were produced with exceptional quality, using the best materials and printing techniques available. Nelson also continued his philanthropic work. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which he had helped establish in 1940, continued to fund programs in education, the environment, and international relations. The Museum of Modern Art, where Nelson had served as president and remained a major donor and supporter, continued to grow and expand its collection. The Museum of Primitive Arts collection had been transferred to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it became the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing, named for Nelson's son, who had disappeared in New Guinea in 1961 during an anthropological expedition. Michael's death had been a devastating blow to Nelson. The young man, just 23 years old, had been collecting artifacts from indigenous peoples in New Guinea when his boat capsized. He apparently tried to swim to shore, but was never seen again. Despite extensive searches and investigations, his body was never recovered. The most likely explanation, though never proven, was that he drowned or was attacked by sharks or crocodiles in the shark-infested waters. For Nelson, losing Michael was a reminder that even the Rockefeller fortune couldn't protect against all tragedies, that wealth and power had limits. He established the wing at the Metropolitan Museum as a memorial, ensuring that Michael's passion for indigenous art would be remembered and celebrated. As Nelson entered his final years, he remained energetic and active. He continued to collect art, adding to a personal collection that already numbered in the thousands of pieces. He maintained his townhouse on West 54th Street in Manhattan, filled with art and memories. He stayed connected to politics, advising younger politicians and commenting occasionally on current events. But he was also increasingly aware of his own mortality. He had had health scares over the years. He knew that at age 70, he had more years behind him than ahead, and perhaps he felt some urgency to make the most of the time remaining. On the evening of January 26, 1979, Nelson Rockefeller was at his townhouse with Megan Marshak, a 25-year-old woman who worked on his staff. The official story was that they were working on an art book together when Nelson suffered a massive heart attack. Megan allegedly called for help, and paramedics arrived quickly, but they were unable to revive him. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at Lenox Hill Hospital. He was 70 years old, but as details emerged in the days after his death, the official story began to unravel. It turned out that Megan Marshak had delayed calling 911 for nearly an hour after Nelson collapsed. She had first called a friend, who then called Ponchita Pierce, another Rockefeller staff member who finally called for an ambulance. This delay meant that precious time was lost when prompt medical attention might have saved Nelson's life or at least given him a better chance. There was also speculation about what Nelson and Megan had actually been doing when he collapsed. Some reports suggested they had been romantic partners, that the work story was a cover for an affair. Nelson's family never publicly addressed these rumors, maintaining dignified silence about the circumstances of his death. The delay in calling for help, the presence of a much younger woman, the conflicting stories about what happened, all of it created a scandal that overshadowed Nelson's death and funeral. Newspaper headlines focused as much on the mysterious circumstances as on his accomplishments. Late-night comedians made jokes. It was an undignified end for someone who had spent his life seeking dignity and recognition. The funeral, held at Riverside Church in Manhattan on January 29, 1979, was attended by President Jimmy Carter, former President Ford, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, numerous governors and senators, and hundreds of other dignitaries. Kissinger delivered a eulogy praising Nelson's vision, energy, and commitment to public service. He spoke about Nelson's belief in the power of government to improve people's lives, his support for the arts, his internationalist outlook. But there was an undertone of sadness to the funeral. Nelson had never achieved his greatest goal, the presidency. He had served as vice president for only 2 years with little real power or influence. His final years in office had been marked by rejection and disappointment, and his death had come under circumstances that were embarrassing and mysterious. Nelson was buried at the Rockefeller family cemetery in Sleepy Hollow, New York, not far from the Kikwit estate where he had grown up. He was laid to rest alongside his parents, grandparents, and other family members who had come before. The Rockefeller dynasty continued, but one of its most ambitious and complicated members was gone. In death, Nelson's legacy was complex and contested. Supporters praised his ambition, his willingness to use government power to address social problems, his support for civil rights and social welfare programs, his commitment to education and the arts, his vision of cities and states as places where grand projects could inspire citizens. Critics pointed to his enormous spending as governor that left New York State deeply in debt, his role in the Attica tragedy, his use of wealth to influence politics and destroy opponents, his multiple marriages and rumors of affairs, his inability to connect with ordinary voters despite spending millions on campaigns, his support for policies that expanded government power, sometimes at the expense of individual liberty. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of Nelson's legacy was the financial structure that allowed him to pursue his ambitions without worrying about money. The trusts established by his father in 1934 and 1952 continued to operate after Nelson's death, providing income to his children and eventually his grandchildren. The Rockefeller fortune, though no longer the largest in America, remained substantial and well protected. The strategies pioneered by the Rockefeller family, using trusts to preserve wealth across generations while minimizing taxes, became the standard approach for wealthy families everywhere. Every estate planning attorney studied the Rockefeller model. Every ultra-rich family with dynastic ambitions tried to replicate it. The techniques have evolved and been refined over the decades, but the fundamental principles remain the same. Remove assets from taxable estates through irrevocable trusts, use generation-skipping structures to avoid multiple layers of taxation, diversify investments to protect against economic shocks, employ professional managers to ensure competent oversight, structure distributions to prevent heirs from squandering wealth, invest in income, producing assets that generate steady cash flow, maintain a family office to coordinate all activities, educate each generation about financial stewardship, and integrate philanthropy to generate positive publicity and additional tax benefits. These strategies aren't available to ordinary families. Creating and maintaining trusts requires expensive legal and financial expertise. Family offices are practical only for fortunes measured in tens or hundreds of millions at minimum. The tax benefits are most dramatic for the ultra-wealthy, whose estates would otherwise be subject to the highest rates. This means that wealth preservation techniques that work brilliantly for the super-rich are essentially irrelevant for everyone else. The Rockefellers can pass billions from generation to generation with minimal taxation. Middle-class families might pass a house and some savings to their children, but they don't have access to the sophisticated structures that protect dynastic wealth. This disparity has enormous implications for inequality in America. While the Rockefeller fortune was built over a century ago, it continues to provide wealth and opportunity to descendants who had nothing to do with creating it. Meanwhile, families without inherited wealth must start from scratch in each generation, building whatever they can through their own work and savings. Defenders of dynastic wealth argue that people should be free to provide for their descendants, that wealth represents property rights that should be respected, that inherited wealth often supports important philanthropic activities, and that taxing estates too heavily would discourage saving and investment. Critics argue that inherited wealth creates an aristocracy inconsistent with American ideals of equal opportunity, that the children of the wealthy have enormous advantages over everyone else through no merit of their own, that dynastic wealth concentrates too much power in too few hands, and that estate taxes on the largest fortunes are necessary for a functioning democracy. Nelson Rockefeller's life embodied these tensions. He benefited enormously from inherited wealth that allowed him to pursue his ambitions without financial constraints. He never had to worry about paying rent or putting food on the table. He could afford to spend years in government service at relatively modest salaries because trust income provided all the money he needed. He could invest in risky ventures like IBEC that might never turn a profit. He could buy art that cost millions. He could spend millions on political campaigns. Yet Nelson also devoted much of his life to public service, to trying to improve conditions for people who weren't born into wealth. He expanded educational opportunities through the State University of New York system. He supported civil rights legislation. He created jobs through construction projects. He advocated for using government power to address poverty and inequality. He believed that the wealthy had obligations to society. That privilege brought responsibility. This combination of inherited privilege and genuine commitment to public service made Nelson a complicated figure. He was simultaneously an exemplar of everything good and bad about dynastic wealth in America. The wealth gave him opportunities to make real contributions to society, but it also insulated him from consequences that would have destroyed someone without resources. His divorce and remarriage might have ended another politician's career, but the Rockefeller money and name protected him. His role in Attica should have haunted him more than it did, but wealth provided a cushion that softened many blows. The trusts that protected the Rockefeller fortune continue to operate decades after Nelson's death. The 1934 trusts were designed to mature on the death of the last beneficiary from the fourth generation, which hasn't happened yet. This means that trusts created 90 years ago are still controlling how wealth is distributed today, still shaping the lives of people who weren't even born when the trusts were established. The 1952 trusts, designed specifically for grandchildren and later generations, could potentially last even longer. Depending on how they were structured and what state law applies, they might continue for another century or more. Wealth that John D. Rockefeller earned in the late 1800s could still be providing income to his descendants in the late 2010s, a span of nearly 300 years. This is the ultimate achievement of wealth preservation, creating structures that transcend individual lifetimes, that persist across generations, that ensure your descendants will be wealthy long after you're gone. It's a kind of immortality through money, a way of extending your influence far into the future, even after your death. But it also raises profound questions about fairness and opportunity in American society. If the descendants of John D. Rockefeller can live comfortably off wealth earned over a century ago, what does that mean for equality of opportunity? How can someone from a poor family compete with someone who has access to trust income, family connections, elite education, and all the other advantages that inherited wealth provides. These are questions without easy answers, questions that touch on fundamental values about property rights, equality, meritocracy, and the role of government. Nelson Rockefeller would likely have said that inherited wealth brings obligations to use that wealth responsibly, to give back to society, to support worthy causes. He would have pointed to his own public service, to the Rockefeller philanthropies that have given away billions, to the institutions like MoMA and the State University of New York that have benefited millions. Critics would respond that philanthropy doesn't eliminate the fundamental unfairness of inherited wealth, that no amount of charitable giving can justify the concentration of resources in a few families while millions struggle, that democratic societies shouldn't have hereditary aristocracies even if those aristocrats are sometimes generous. As we near the end of Nelson's story, it's worth reflecting on what his life teaches us about wealth, power, ambition, and legacy in America. He was born into extraordinary privilege, with every advantage money could provide. He used those advantages to pursue ambitious goals, transforming Latin American development policy, building cultural institutions, expanding educational opportunities, trying to win the presidency. He achieved remarkable things. The State University of New York system educates hundreds of thousands of students every year, providing opportunities that wouldn't exist without Nelson's vision and political skill. The Museum of Modern Art, which his mother founded and which he led as president, has introduced millions of people to modern art and helped American audiences appreciate creativity and innovation in visual arts. But Nelson also fell short of his ultimate goal. Despite spending more money on political campaigns than almost anyone in American history up to that time, despite having the famous Rockefeller name and connections throughout the establishment, despite years of preparation and multiple attempts, he never won the presidency. He never even secured his party's nomination. This failure wasn't because of lack of intelligence or energy or commitment. Nelson was brilliant in his own way, tremendously hard-working, and absolutely committed to his political ambitions. But he was caught in an impossible position: too liberal for conservative Republicans and too Republican for liberal Democrats. His wealth, which should have been an advantage, became a liability as voters grew suspicious of politicians who seemed disconnected from ordinary people's struggles. His personal life also complicated his political ambitions. The divorce from Todd, after 32 years of marriage, followed quickly by marriage to Happy Murphy, who was 18 years younger and who had left her own husband and children to be with Nelson, scandalized many voters. In the early 1960s, divorce was still somewhat taboo, especially among the Republican base that Nelson needed to win the nomination. The circumstances of his second marriage, with Happy abandoning her children, struck many people as selfish and irresponsible. These personal scandals might have been forgiven if Nelson had had other overwhelming advantages, but he didn't. He wasn't a brilliant orator who could move crowds with speeches. He wasn't personally warm or relatable in the way that successful politicians like Ronald Reagan would prove to be. He was energetic and hardworking, but also sometimes imperious and impatient with people who couldn't keep up with his pace. The Attica tragedy became the lowest point of his governorship, a moment when his instincts failed him catastrophically. His refusal to visit the prison personally, to speak with inmates and hostages, to try to find a peaceful resolution, seemed like the worst kind of cowardice and detachment. His authorization of deadly force that killed 39 people, including 10 of the hostages he was supposedly trying to rescue, was a decision he would defend for the rest of his life, but which many people found indefensible. And yet, despite all these failures and controversies, Nelson's life mattered. He demonstrated that wealthy people can use their resources and positions to try to improve society. He showed that government can take on ambitious projects like expanding higher education or building cultural institutions. He proved that American capitalism could at least attempt to address global poverty through ventures like IBEC, even if the results were mixed. His art collecting and patronage helped support countless artists and brought beautiful objects into the world that continue to inspire people today. His Museum of Primitive Art, later integrated into the Metropolitan Museum, helped Western audiences appreciate indigenous art from cultures that had often been dismissed or ignored. His support for modern art helped establish American museums as centers of innovation and creativity rather than just repositories for European old masters. The financial structures his family created have preserved wealth across 5 generations now, allowing Rockefellers to continue supporting philanthropic causes, cultural institutions, and political candidates. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Rockefeller Foundation, and other family philanthropies have given away billions of dollars to support causes ranging from environmental protection to public health to arts education. But these accomplishments must be balanced against the costs. The wealth that allows Rockefeller philanthropy was built through business practices that crushed competition and concentrated enormous economic power. The Standard Oil monopoly that made the family rich was dismantled by the Supreme Court specifically because it violated antitrust laws and harmed consumers. The Rockefeller fortune was built partly on practices that are now illegal. The trust structures that preserved this wealth across generations have helped the Rockefellers avoid paying billions in taxes that would have otherwise gone to support government programs. While it's all legal, it raises questions about whether the ultra-wealthy should be able to use sophisticated legal strategies to avoid taxes that ordinary people can't avoid. Nelson's political career, despite its ambitions and accomplishments, also highlights the corrosive influence of money in politics. He spent tens of millions of dollars on campaigns, far more than any opponent could match. He used his wealth to commission negative research on opponents like Arthur Goldberg. He made large financial gifts to political allies like Henry Kissinger that looked suspiciously like attempts to buy influence. His governorship of New York, while marked by ambitious construction projects and program expansions, also left the state deeply in debt with high taxes that burdened residents for decades afterward. The Empire State Plaza, his signature building project in Albany, cost nearly $2 billion, an almost unimaginable sum that dwarfed the budgets of many other states' entire governments. Was it worth it? Did the symbolic value of imposing modernist buildings justify the enormous expense? These are questions each person must answer for themselves. Nelson Rockefeller's legacy is too complex for simple judgments. He was simultaneously admirable and troubling, accomplished and failed, generous and self-serving. He represented both the best possibilities of enlightened wealth and the worst problems of concentrated power. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider what lessons Nelson's extraordinary life might hold for your own, much more ordinary one. You probably don't have access to dynastic wealth or trust income that provides financial security, regardless of whether you work. You probably won't serve as governor or vice president. You probably won't collect art worth millions or build cultural institutions that bear your name. But you do have choices about how to use whatever resources you have. You can choose to pursue goals beyond just accumulating money. You can choose to contribute to your community in ways large or small. You can choose to support causes you believe in. You can choose to create beauty or knowledge or experiences that enrich other people's lives. You can also recognize that privilege comes in many forms. If you were born in a wealthy country, you have privileges that most of the world's population lacks. If you had access to decent education, you benefited from opportunities that many don't have. If you have stable housing and reliable food, you're ahead of billions of people. Privilege isn't binary, it's a spectrum, and almost everyone has some advantages they didn't earn. The question is, what you do with whatever advantages you have. Nelson Rockefeller had extraordinary advantages, more than almost anyone who has ever lived. He used them to pursue power and try to shape American society according to his vision. He succeeded in some ways and failed in others. His life was marked by tremendous accomplishments and significant failures, by moments of inspiration and moments of tragedy. Your life will be different in almost every way from Nelson's. But you too will face choices about ambition and contentment, about using your resources for yourself or for others, about what legacy you want to leave. You too will experience successes that bring satisfaction and failures that teach hard lessons. You too will try to balance personal happiness with larger purposes, immediate gratification with long-term goals. The great equalizer, the force that makes the poorest and richest ultimately similar, is time. Nelson Rockefeller had his 70 years, filled with extraordinary experiences and opportunities, but also subject to the same fundamental limitations we all face. He couldn't avoid aging. He couldn't prevent death. He couldn't achieve everything he wanted, despite having more resources than almost anyone to help him try. In the end, wealthy or poor, powerful or ordinary, we all face the same ultimate reality. Our time is limited. Our power is constrained. Our accomplishments will eventually be forgotten by all but a few. The Rockefeller name will probably persist longer than most, kept alive by the institutions John D. Sr. and his descendants created. But even that is temporary. Even the mightiest empires fade. Even the greatest fortunes eventually dissipate. Even the most famous names eventually slip into obscurity. What matters then isn't how much wealth you accumulate or how powerful you become. What matters is how you treat people along the way, what you create that might outlast you, whether you use your time and resources in ways that align with your values, whether you can look back on your life and feel that it had meaning and purpose beyond just your own comfort and pleasure. Nelson Rockefeller would have said his life had meaning. He would have pointed to the State University of New York, to the museums and art institutions he supported, to his years of government service, to IBEC's attempts to combine profit with social responsibility. Whether you agree that these accomplishments justified the privilege and wealth he enjoyed is something only you can decide. But as you sleep tonight, let Nelson's story remind you that no amount of money can guarantee happiness or fulfillment, that even the most ambitious plans can fail despite every advantage, that privilege brings obligations as well as opportunities, and that legacy is complicated and multifaceted, resistant to simple judgments of success or failure. Rest now, knowing that your life, however ordinary it might seem, compared to Nelson Rockefeller's extraordinary one, still contains the same fundamental possibilities for meaning, purpose, and contribution. You might not change the world in ways that make history books, but you can still make a difference in the lives of people around you. You might not build institutions that last centuries, but you can still create moments of beauty, kindness, or wisdom that ripple outward in ways you'll never fully see. Sweet dreams, and remember, Wealth is just a tool. Power is just an opportunity. And what you do with whatever you have is what ultimately defines your life's meaning. If this story has helped you learn something new or given you food for thought as you drift off to sleep, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Sleep Edification. We create content designed to educate and relax, to expand your mind while helping your body rest. Leave a comment below, sharing what aspect of Nelson Rockefeller's life you found most interesting or surprising. Tell us what other historical figures you'd like us to explore in future videos, and share this with friends who enjoy learning while they relax. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight. Until our next journey together through history's fascinating stories, sleep well, dream big, and wake up ready to make the most of your own extraordinary, ordinary life. Before we close tonight's story, let's take one final, deeper look at the trust strategies that made the Rockefeller wealth so enduring, because understanding these mechanisms helps us understand how wealth inequality perpetuates itself in America, and why breaking dynastic patterns is so difficult. The mathematical power of compound growth protected from taxation is staggering. Imagine that John D. Rockefeller Jr. had simply given his children cash instead of creating trusts. That cash would have been subject to estate taxes when he died. At the rates that existed in 1960 when he passed away, the federal government might have claimed 70% or more of the largest fortunes, so a $40 million gift might have been reduced to $12 million after taxes. Then, when Nelson and his siblings died and tried to pass their wealth to their own children, another 70% might have been claimed. 12 million becomes 3.6 million. And when those grandchildren die, trying to pass wealth to the great-grandchildren, 70% goes to taxes again. 3.6 million becomes about 1 million. Over 3 generations, the 40 million would have shrunk to just 1 million, a 97.5% reduction due to estate taxes. But with properly structured trusts, that same 40 million could grow and compound across generations while largely avoiding taxation. Professional managers invest the funds wisely, generating returns that average perhaps 7 or 8% annually over many decades. 40 million growing at 7% for 60 years becomes over $1.5 billion. Even after accounting for distributions to beneficiaries, the trust principle can continue growing, providing income for generation after generation. This is why families like the Rockefellers remain wealthy so long after the original fortune was made. It's not just that they started with a lot of money. It's that they structured that money in ways that allowed it to grow and compound while being protected from the taxes that would otherwise erode it. The wealth machine, once properly constructed, can run essentially forever if maintained by competent professionals. The Rockefeller trusts also employed what's called a spendthrift clause, a provision that prevents beneficiaries from pledging trust assets as collateral for loans, or allowing creditors to claim trust assets to satisfy debts. This means that even if a Rockefeller heir makes terrible financial decisions, runs up huge debts, or faces lawsuits, the trust assets remain protected. The heir might receive less income from the trust as punishment for irresponsible behavior, but they can't lose the trust principle itself. Another sophisticated technique the Rockefellers used was what's sometimes called the dynasty trust or perpetual trust structure. Traditional trust law in many states required that trusts eventually terminate, typically within the lifespan of people alive when the trust was created, plus 21 years. This is called the rule against perpetuities, and it was designed to prevent people from controlling property forever from beyond the grave. But starting in the 1980s and 1990s, several states eliminated or greatly relaxed their rule against perpetuities, allowing trusts to last for hundreds of years or even forever. Wealthy families began moving their trusts to states with favorable perpetual trust laws like Delaware, South Dakota, or Alaska. While the Rockefeller trusts were created before these changes, similar long-term thinking informed their structure. The goal was always to create structures that would last as long as legally possible, protecting wealth for the maximum number of generations. This multi-generational thinking is perhaps the most important distinction between how the wealthy approach money and how everyone else does. Most people think about money in terms of their own lifetime, earning enough to live comfortably, maybe saving enough to retire, hopefully leaving something to their children. The ultra-wealthy think in terms of centuries, creating structures designed to preserve wealth for descendants who haven't even been born yet. This different time horizon changes everything. If you're thinking about centuries rather than decades, short-term fluctuations in markets or the economy become less important. You can weather recessions, depressions, even major crises, because you know the long-term trend is upward. You can take a more patient approach to investments, holding quality assets for generations rather than trading frequently. It also changes your relationship to spending and consumption. If you see yourself as a steward of wealth that belongs to your lineage rather than as an individual owner who can spend as he pleases, you become more conservative about withdrawals. You live on income generated by the trust, but try to preserve the principal for future generations. This creates a virtuous cycle where the principal keeps growing, generating more income, which allows more generous distributions to an expanding family while still maintaining the trust's value. The family office structure that the Rockefellers pioneered is another crucial element of wealth preservation. A family office is essentially a private company whose sole purpose is managing one family's wealth. For the Rockefellers, this meant employing dozens of people: investment managers who made decisions about stocks, bonds, and alternative investments, real estate specialists who oversaw property holdings, tax attorneys who navigated complex tax codes, estate planners who structured trusts and foundations, accountants who tracked every dollar, and administrative staff who coordinated everything. These professionals weren't just employees. Many became deeply integrated into the family's life, serving multiple generations, understanding family values and goals, providing continuity even as individual family members aged and died. They created an institutional memory about what investments worked, what strategies were successful, what mistakes to avoid. For ultra-wealthy families, the family office is worth the cost, even though it might employ 50 or 100 people at an annual expense of millions of dollars. If you have $1 billion fortune and a family office improves returns by just 1% annually while saving another percent through tax strategies, that's $20 million in annual value, far more than the office costs to operate. But family offices are only practical for fortunes well into the hundreds of millions at minimum. For smaller estates, the math doesn't work. This creates yet another advantage for the ultra-wealthy. They can afford sophisticated management that improves returns and reduces costs in ways that smaller fortunes cannot. The Rockefeller approach also integrated philanthropy into wealth preservation in clever ways. By establishing charitable foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, the family created institutions that served multiple purposes. The foundations did important work supporting public health, education, and scientific research. They also provided the family with leadership positions, allowing Rockefellers to serve as foundation trustees and officers, roles that carried prestige and influence even without direct financial compensation. The foundations also provided tax benefits. Assets transferred to foundations were removed from taxable estates. Donations to foundations were tax-deductible. The foundations themselves paid no taxes on investment income, allowing assets to grow tax-free as long as they were eventually used for charitable purposes. And the foundations could employ family members in paid staff positions, providing income to younger family members who were learning about wealth management and philanthropy. This integration of charitable giving with wealth preservation created a system where doing good was also financially smart. The Rockefellers genuinely believed in supporting worthy causes, but they structured that support in ways that also provided tax advantages and maintained family influence and prestige. It was enlightened self-interest at its most sophisticated. The educational component of the Rockefeller system shouldn't be overlooked either. Family meetings were held regularly where financial matters were discussed openly. Children learned from a young age about budgeting, investing, the responsibilities of wealth, and the importance of giving back. When they came of age to receive trust distributions, they weren't suddenly overwhelmed by wealth they didn't understand. They had been prepared through years of gradual education and increasing responsibility. This educational approach helps explain why some wealthy families, like the Rockefellers, maintain their fortunes across generations while others see wealth dissipate after just 1 or 2 generations. It's not just about having smart trust structures and good investment managers, it's also about preparing each generation to be responsible stewards, teaching them that wealth brings obligations as well as opportunities, instilling values of hard work and contribution even when financial necessity doesn't require it. The Rockefellers also avoided some of the pitfalls that destroy other wealthy families. They mostly stayed out of high-risk business ventures where a single bad bet could wipe out fortunes. They maintained diversification, never putting too many eggs in one basket. They avoided flamboyant consumption that could drain resources faster than investments could replenish them. They maintained family unity, avoiding bitter feuds over money that could lead to expensive lawsuits and fractured relationships. These behaviors weren't accidental. They were consciously cultivated across generations, reinforced through family culture, supported by the institutional structures the family created. The Rockefellers understood that preserving wealth required not just financial strategies, but also social and cultural ones, that values and behaviors mattered as much as trust documents and investment returns. But we should also acknowledge the darker implications of these wealth preservation strategies. They work brilliantly for the families that employ them, but they contribute to growing inequality in America. When the richest families can pass billions from generation to generation with minimal taxation, while middle-class families struggle to pass on a house and some savings, the gap between rich and poor inevitably widens. This growing inequality has real consequences for American society. It means that children born into wealthy families have enormous advantages in education, healthcare, professional networks, and economic security that children born into poor families lack. It means that political power increasingly concentrates in the hands of the wealthy who can afford to fund campaigns and hire lobbyists. It means that economic mobility, the ability to rise from poverty to prosperity through hard work, becomes increasingly difficult. Defenders of current estate tax policies argue that people have a right to provide for their descendants, that wealth represents property that shouldn't be confiscated by government, and that estate taxes discourage saving and investment. They point out that the wealthy do pay substantial taxes during their lifetimes through income taxes, capital gains taxes, and other levies. But critics argue that dynastic wealth is fundamentally incompatible with democratic ideals of equal opportunity and merit-based advancement. They point out that someone born into the Rockefeller family has life chances that are completely different from someone born into poverty, regardless of talent or work ethic. They argue that estate taxes on the largest fortunes are necessary to prevent the creation of an hereditary aristocracy and to provide revenue for public goods that benefit everyone. Nelson Rockefeller's own views on these questions were complicated. He supported some progressive policies, like expanding educational opportunity and providing government services. But he also used every legal strategy available to minimize his own taxes and protect his personal wealth. He believed in using government power to help people, but he also believed that the wealthy had a right to maintain their privileged position. This tension between supporting policies that would redistribute wealth while personally employing strategies to protect family wealth is common among liberal wealthy individuals. They recognize that inequality is a problem and support some redistribution, but they aren't willing to voluntarily give up their own privileged position. They want to help others rise, but not to actually descend to meet them part way. Whether this represents hypocrisy or reasonable self-interest is something each person must judge for themselves. Nelson would probably have argued that he could do more good keeping his wealth and using it to support worthy causes than he could by simply paying more in taxes to a government that might not spend the money as wisely. Critics would argue that this reasoning allows the wealthy to avoid their fair share of supporting the society that enabled their wealth in the first place. As we reach the end of Nelson's story, these questions about wealth, power, privilege, and responsibility remain unresolved. They're part of ongoing debates about what kind of society America should be, how much inequality is acceptable, what obligations the wealthy have to the rest of society, and how to balance individual property rights with collective needs. Nelson Rockefeller lived in the middle of these tensions. He was born into extraordinary privilege that gave him opportunities few people ever have. He used those opportunities to pursue ambitious goals in business, government, and the arts. He achieved remarkable things, expanding educational opportunity, supporting cultural institutions, trying to reform capitalism to serve social purposes, serving in high government positions where he could influence policy. But he also enjoyed privileges that were fundamentally unfair. His trust income meant he never had to worry about money, even when pursuing careers in public service that paid modest salaries. His family name opened doors that stayed closed to others. His wealth allowed him to fund political campaigns at levels no ordinary person could match. His connections gave him access to power brokers and decision-makers that most people never meet. Whether the good he did with his privileges justified the unfairness of having them is a question without a clear answer. It depends on how you weight his accomplishments against the advantages he had, how you value individual achievement against collective fairness, how you think about merit and opportunity in a society with enormous inherited inequalities. What's clear is that the financial structures the Rockefeller family created, especially the sophisticated use of trusts to preserve wealth across generations, have had enormous influence on how American inequality has evolved over the past century. These structures allowed dynastic wealth to persist and grow even as the original fortunes were made generations earlier. They created a template that other wealthy families have copied, spreading sophisticated wealth preservation techniques throughout the upper class. The result is an America where inequality is greater now than at any time since the Gilded Age, when John D. Rockefeller Sr. was building his oil empire. The richest families can pass billions from generation to generation. The poorest families struggle to provide basic opportunities for their children. The middle class, which once represented the majority of Americans, is shrinking as more people fall toward poverty and fewer rise toward wealth. Nelson Rockefeller's life spanned much of the 20th century, from 1908 to 1979, a period when America went from being a relatively equal society to one with vast disparities between rich and poor. He both benefited from that inequality and, in his own way, tried to address some of its consequences through support for education, the arts, and government programs. Whether his efforts made America more or less equal is debatable. The State University of New York system he expanded provided educational opportunities to hundreds of thousands, but the trust structures his family employed helped concentrate wealth in ways that made climbing the economic ladder harder for those born without such advantages. He supported some redistributive policies, but he also protected his personal fortune using every legal strategy available. In the end, Nelson Rockefeller was a product of his time and class, progressive enough to believe government should help people, but not so progressive that he was willing to fundamentally challenge the system that made his family wealthy. He wanted to help others rise, but from a position that maintained his own elevated status. He believed in opportunity, but an opportunity that preserved rather than eliminated hierarchies. As you rest tonight, consider what lessons Nelson's complex legacy might hold. Think about how privilege shapes outcomes in ways we don't always acknowledge. Reflect on the tensions between individual success and collective fairness, between using whatever advantages you have and recognizing that some advantages are fundamentally unfair. Contemplate what obligations we might have to use our resources, whatever they are, in ways that benefit others and not just ourselves. You are not Nelson Rockefeller. You probably don't have trust funds or family offices or access to the sophisticated wealth preservation strategies that work for billionaires. But you do have choices about how to use whatever resources, advantages, and opportunities you do have. You can choose to think beyond just your own comfort and consider how your actions affect others. You can choose to support policies and causes that might not directly benefit you, but that make society more fair and opportunity more widely available. Nelson's story reminds us that wealth is power, that privilege perpetuates itself unless consciously interrupted, that individual accomplishment is always built partly on circumstances we don't control, and that legacy is complicated, mixing achievement with privilege, contribution with advantage, success with structural unfairness. Sweet dreams, and may tomorrow bring opportunities to make choices that you can be proud of, that contribute something positive to the world, that help others even in small ways, and that allow you to sleep peacefully, knowing you're trying to live according to your values, whatever they might be. Thank you for learning with us tonight. Please remember to subscribe, like, and share if you found this journey through Nelson Rockefeller's extraordinary life worth your time. Until we meet again, sleep well, learn well, and live well. One more reflection before we close, because Nelson Rockefeller's story deserves one final meditation on what it means to have everything and still want more, to achieve so much and still feel incomplete, to leave such a complicated legacy that defies simple judgment. Nelson spent his entire life chasing the presidency, the one prize that all his wealth and connections and energy couldn't deliver. He ran 3 times in 1960, 1964, and 1968, losing each time. He served as vice president for 2 disappointing years, sidelined and ineffective. He died never having achieved the goal that motivated so much of his political career. And yet, would winning the presidency actually have made his life more meaningful or successful? Presidents are constrained by Congress, by courts, by public opinion, by international events beyond their control. Nelson, as governor of New York, had arguably more freedom to implement his vision than he might have had as president. As governor, he could push through the state university expansion, could build the Empire State Plaza, could create the Arts Council, could shape New York in ways that reflected his values and ambitions. As president, he would have faced constant opposition, compromise, limitation. Perhaps the lesson here is about how we measure success and failure. By the metric Nelson chose for himself, winning the presidency, his political career was a failure. He never achieved the goal he wanted most. But by almost any other measure, his career was extraordinarily successful. He served as governor of New York for 15 years, longer than all but one person in the state's history. He held multiple high positions in the federal government. He influenced American policy toward Latin America for decades. He supported arts and education in ways that benefited millions. The tragedy, if there is one, is that Nelson couldn't appreciate his own success because he was so focused on the one thing he didn't achieve. He let the presidency that he never won overshadow the governorship he dominated for 15 years. He let failure in his presidential bids diminish the satisfaction he might have taken in building SUNY or supporting MoMA or reforming Latin American policy. This is a trap that many driven people fall into. They set one ultimate goal and treat everything else as insufficient if that goal isn't reached. It doesn't matter how much they accomplish along the way. If they don't achieve the one thing they defined as ultimate success, they feel they've failed. This goal-oriented thinking can motivate tremendous effort and achievement, but it can also prevent people from appreciating what they do accomplish and finding satisfaction in successes that don't match their original ambitions. Nelson's first marriage to Todd, which lasted 32 years and produced 5 children, might be seen as another casualty of his relentless ambition. As he became more consumed by his political career, by his governorship and presidential ambitions, he had less time and attention for his family. The marriage apparently became more a partnership of convenience than a source of emotional fulfillment. When Nelson fell in love with Happy Murphy in the late 1950s, he was willing to divorce Todd and remarry, even knowing the scandal would likely destroy his presidential chances. What does it say about someone that they sacrifice their marriage and family stability for political ambition, and then sacrifice those political ambitions for a new romantic relationship? It suggests someone who was never quite satisfied with what he had, always looking for the next thing that might finally bring fulfillment. First, it was business success. Then, it was government service. Then, it was the governorship. Then, it was the presidency. Then, it was a new marriage. Each achievement or change brought temporary satisfaction, but never the lasting contentment that would allow him to stop striving and simply be satisfied with what he had accomplished. This restless ambition is characteristic of many successful people. They're driven not by contentment, but by dissatisfaction, not by appreciating what they have, but by reaching for what they don't. This drive can produce remarkable achievements, but it often comes at a personal cost: broken relationships, children who feel neglected, an inability to simply enjoy the present moment, a constant sense that whatever you've done isn't quite enough. The question is whether the achievements justify the personal costs. Did the state university system that benefited hundreds of thousands of students justify the time Nelson didn't spend with his own children? Did the political career that influenced policy toward Latin America and civil rights justify the broken marriage to Todd? Did the art collecting and museum building justify the relentless pace that left little time for quiet reflection or simple pleasure? These questions don't have objective answers. Each person will weigh the trade-offs differently. Some will admire Nelson's dedication to public service and willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for larger goals. Others will critique his inability to find balance, his prioritization of ambition over relationships, his apparent need to constantly achieve more rather than appreciating what he already had. What seems clear is that wealth alone didn't make Nelson happy. If it could, he would have been among the happiest people who ever lived. He had more money than almost anyone, more resources, more opportunities, more options than perhaps 99.99% of humanity. And yet he spent his life striving for more power, more influence, more achievement, more recognition. The trust funds that provided financial security didn't bring emotional security. The family name that opened every door didn't open the door to the presidency. The connections that gave him access to power brokers couldn't deliver the Republican nomination. The wealth that could buy almost anything couldn't buy the satisfaction and contentment that comes from within, rather than from external achievements. In his final years, after leaving the vice presidency in 1977, Nelson had 2 years to reflect on his life before his death in 1979. Did he find peace in those final years? Did he come to appreciate what he had accomplished rather than mourning what he had failed to achieve? Did he enjoy his art collection, his relationship with Happy, the leisure that came from having no official responsibilities? Or did he continue to feel restless, dissatisfied, wishing he could have one more chance at the presidency, one more opportunity to prove himself on that ultimate stage? We can't know what was in Nelson's heart during those final years, but we can see in his life a pattern that might serve as either an inspiration or a warning, depending on our own values and goals. He shows us what's possible when someone with extraordinary resources pursues ambitious goals with relentless energy. He also shows us the costs of such a life: the personal relationships strained or broken, the inability to find satisfaction in remarkable achievements because they fell short of ultimate goals, the sense of incompleteness despite accomplishing more than most people dream of. As you drift into sleep tonight, ask yourself what success means to you. Is it defined by one ultimate goal, like Nelson's presidency, something that you either achieve or fail at with no middle ground? Or is it defined more broadly as living according to your values, treating people well, contributing what you can with whatever resources you have, finding moments of joy and meaning along the way, even if you never achieve everything you hoped for? Think about whether you're appreciating what you have or only focusing on what you lack. Consider whether your ambitions are pulling you forward in healthy ways or preventing you from being present in your life as it actually exists right now. Reflect on whether the goals you're pursuing are truly your own, or whether they're imposed by society, family, or an internalized voice telling you that what you've done isn't enough until you achieve some external marker of success. Nelson Rockefeller had every advantage and yet died feeling, perhaps, that he hadn't achieved his ultimate goal. Many people with far less have died feeling satisfied that they lived good lives, helped people, made a difference in their communities, raised children who turned out well, created small pockets of beauty or kindness or wisdom in a difficult world. The external achievements matter less than the internal sense of having lived according to your values and made peace with the life you actually had, rather than mourning the life you imagined. This doesn't mean we shouldn't have ambitions or work hard to achieve our goals. Nelson's ambition built universities, funded art institutions, shaped government policy, and influenced millions of lives. Ambition and drive can be forces for tremendous good, but they need to be balanced with appreciation for what is, not just striving for what might be. They need to be tempered with the wisdom to know when you've done enough, when more achievement won't actually bring more satisfaction, when it's time to stop striving and start simply being. The Rockefeller wealth could buy almost anything, but it couldn't buy this wisdom. The trust funds could provide financial security, but not emotional peace. The family name could open doors, but not guarantee happiness. Nelson had to learn these lessons the same way everyone does, through living, failing, succeeding, reflecting on what actually mattered. In the end, we're all equal in our need for love, meaning, connection, and purpose. We all face the same fundamental questions about how to live good lives. We all struggle with balancing ambition and contentment, work and relationships, personal desires and obligations to others. Having more money changes the particular form these struggles take, but it doesn't eliminate them. So as you rest tonight, remember that your life, though different in almost every detail from Nelson Rockefeller's, shares the same fundamental structure: a limited span of time, choices to make about how to spend that time, relationships that matter more than achievements, and an ultimate question about what kind of person you want to be and what kind of life you want to have lived when your time runs out. Nelson's answer to these questions was to pursue power, to build institutions, to collect beauty, to marry twice, to father children who had complicated relationships with a driven and often absent father, to work until he literally died at age 70, still active and engaged, but never quite satisfied. Your answer will be different because you're different, because your circumstances are different, because your values and opportunities are different. But the questions remain the same. What matters most? How should I spend my limited time? What do I want to contribute? What relationships do I need to nurture? What kind of person do I want to become? What legacy, large or small, do I hope to leave? These are the questions that unite us all, rich and poor, powerful and ordinary, accomplished and struggling. Nelson Rockefeller grappled with them from a position of extraordinary privilege. You grapple with them from wherever you are, but the grappling itself is what defines a life examined, a life lived with intention rather than just flowing along on autopilot. Rest now, knowing that tomorrow brings another chance to choose who you want to be, how you want to treat people, what you want to contribute, what you want to learn, how you want to grow. Every day is an opportunity to shape your life according to your values, to make choices you can be proud of, to contribute something, however small, to making the world slightly better than you found it. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with clarity about what matters most to you, and energy to pursue it with passion, tempered by wisdom, ambition balanced with contentment, striving complemented by appreciation for what already is. Thank you for joining us on this deep exploration of Nelson Rockefeller's extraordinary, complicated, instructive life. Please subscribe to Sleep Edification for more stories that educate while you rest, that expand your mind while relaxing your body, that help you understand history and human nature in ways that might inform your own journey. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about Nelson's legacy, and let us know what other historical figures you'd like us to explore. Share this video with others who might enjoy learning in this format. Until next time, sleep peacefully, dream wisely, and live intentionally. Good night.